What starts here changes the world. I have a few suggestions that may help you on your way to a better world. And while these lessons were learned during my time in the military, I can assure you that it matters not whether you ever served a day in uniform. It matters not your gender, your ethnic or religious background, your orientation, or your social status. Our struggles in this world are similar, and the lessons to overcome those struggles and to move forward, changing ourselves and changing the world around us, will apply equally to all. So here are the 10 lessons I learned from basic SEAL training that hopefully will be of value to you as you move forward in life. Every morning in SEAL training, my instructors, who at the time were all Vietnam veterans, would show up in my barracks room, and the first thing they'd do was inspect my bed. If you did it right, the corners would be square, the covers would be pulled tight, the pillow centered just under the headboard, and the extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of the rack. It was a simple task, mundane at best, but every morning we were required to make our bed to perfection. It seemed a little ridiculous at the time, particularly in light of the fact that we were aspiring to be real warriors, tough, battle-hardened SEALs. But the wisdom of this simple act has been proven to me many times over. If you make your bed every morning, you will have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride, and it will encourage you to do another task, and another, and another. And by the end of the day, that one task completed will have turned into many tasks completed. Making your bed will also reinforce the fact that the little things in life matter. If you can't do the little things right, you'll never be able to do the big things right. And if by chance you have a miserable day, you will come home to a bed that is made, that you made. And a made bed gives you encouragement that tomorrow will be better. So if you want to change the world, start off by making your bed. During SEAL training, the students are all broken down into boat crews. Each crew is 7 students, 3 on each side of a small rubber boat, and 1 coxswain to help guide the dinghy. Every day your boat crew forms up on the beach and is instructed to get through the surf zone and paddle several miles down the coast. In the winter, the surf off San Diego can get to be 8 to 10 feet high, and it is exceedingly difficult to paddle through the plunging surf unless everyone digs in. Every paddle must be synchronized to the stroke count of the coxswain. Everyone must exert equal effort, or the boat will turn against the wave and be unceremoniously dumped back on the beach. For the boat to make it to its destination, everyone must paddle. You can't change the world alone. You will need some help. And to truly get from your starting point to your destination takes friends, colleagues, the goodwill of strangers, and a strong coxswain to guide you. If you want to change the world, find someone to help you paddle. Over a few weeks of difficult training, my SEAL class, which started with 150 men, was down to just 42. There were now 6 boat crews of 7 men each. I was in the boat with the tall guys, but the best boat crew we had was made up of the little guys, the Munchkin crew, we called them. No one was over 5'5". The Munchkin boat crew had 1 American Indian, 1 African American, 1 Polish American, 1 Greek American, 1 Italian American, and 2 tough kids from the Midwest. They out-paddled, outran, and outswam all the other boat crews. The big men in the other boat crews would always make good-natured fun of the tiny little flippers the Munchkins put on their tiny little feet prior to every swim. But somehow these little guys from every corner of the nation and the world always had the last laugh, swimming faster than everyone and reaching the shore long before the rest of us. SEAL training was a great equalizer. Nothing mattered but your will to succeed, not your color, not your ethnic background, not your education, not your social status. If you want to change the world, measure a person by the size of their heart, not by the size of their flippers.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Karis Project podcast. Today we have with us Rachel Rodriguez, who's running for governor of Florida you're also a lawyer, and you've done a lot of work with the COVID and government overreach and so forth. And you're also a first generation American and whose parents fled communism out of Cuba, and your husband also did so later on. So, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dale, for having me today. And I'm in fact running for governor here in Florida. I know candidates, but the reason I'm doing it, and I am here based in South Florida. I have my law practice here that I practice around the country through. But the reason I'm running is, in fact, it's in part my husband came from Cuba. My mother fled Cuba in the 60s. And so I know tyranny when I see it. You know, sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it started, but people who have been through it, they can understand it. And I think in part, you know, it's a spiritual kind of understanding too. We are in a spiritual war. The idea of oppressing people and taking away their human rights, which are given by God.
Yes.
Among them, life, liberty, and happiness.
Yes.
When you see that the state is taking that, you know, you have to take a stand.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I grew up in Canada. I was born and raised here, and I've been to the States a few times growing up, and there's a lot of similarities in the way that our life was. And one thing that we valued was personal freedom. You know what I mean? And I grew up out west, where it's like, on the prairies, where you had a lot of open space and nobody bothered you. And so I was like, the government is there to maintain law and order, and then stay out of my life, right? Leave me alone.
Right. That's right. I mean, at baseline, we are to use what God has given us, including life and liberty. And we are things. And we're to do that starting with the family unit as a governmental structure, if you will. And then to work in community with other people to build things through our gifting. All of us are so unique and gifted. Yes. And we're supposed to do that. The government there, by our consent in this country, that's our system, in order to allow for that flourishing, not to restrict it, not to stand on top of it and start to consume it. It's there to ensure that level of flourishing, that level of productivity can go on within the guardrails of, frankly, of moral law, if you will. I mean, I think it's kind of that simple.
Well, yes. And, one of the things is the United States has a very, very beautiful constitution, and the way their government is laid out. Other countries wish they had a constitution like the United States, and Canada is one of them, because it's, they have no limitations on the rights. And the Constitution was constructed to protect the rights that were laid out in the Declaration of Independence. And it describes a lot of things that we're seeing now today with the government encroachment. If you actually go back and read it and see why they said we need to leave, every single thing that they laid out is happening now.
Yes, and that's exactly right.
People don't realize the province that they were referring to was Canada, because the king at the time Canada was called Quebec. And they had the whole thing called Quebec, and that was a province to the north that they were using as a proxy to restrict the movements and the expansion of the United States and to box them in. And if you looked at the way they expanded the map, they were encroaching into large areas where would be the United States. And so they were just like, forget it, we're done. And we need to do the same thing, except we don't need to go through the bloodshed, because they created the Constitution in order to deal with these crises with using the channels that they put out there, and people need to start making use of that.
Oh, I agree. In fact, it's interesting you made the Declaration of Independence, where it enumerated the, I would say crimes, but it's really the violations, some crimes, of the king with regard to the people in the colonies. And you just start reading it, an history list of what our governments are doing right now. And the implications of that are stunning, because, of course, the Declaration of Independence is declaring independence. It is the right of the people when these things occur, potentially to throw. I mean, the implications are huge. I think the beauty of where we are right now is that we do not need to throw off our entire system of government. And I think there is a path forward. There's plenty of patriots, people who do pay attention, who understand that their rights are given by God. And that if we stand in that authority card and we hold people and institutions accountable, that we can do our own house cleaning. And
Well, yeah.
I firmly believe that.
Well, that's why they say they have the right to alter or abolish the government, right? And that's the whole point. It needs to be altered because I was having a conversation with people, and the courts have been used to do this. And this is one of the biggest issues that they had, was that the judges were beholden to the king. Now, we have the same problem in Canada. They have the same thing in the United States. And the way that they are interpreting the Constitution. When I looked and read through the Federalist Papers and listened to what Alexander Hamilton was talking about, the way they're interpreting the Constitution was not sanctioned. The Constitution actually has to stay the same. You have to interpret the law based on the Constitution. Does it match what this says? But the Constitution is supposed to never change. It's supposed to have the principles that you can apply to any situation. Then you won't require as many laws and so forth, because you can look at what it actually means and then apply it to that situation, not change the Constitution to what you think it should be. Now you have this drift, and then the structure doesn't work as it's intended, because it's like a machine.
I completely agree. You're speaking of in essence, if I could call it a paradigm that is outlined verbally as an agreement. This is our agreement of the paradigm we are all operating under here.
Yes.
And so all of our laws need to comport with that paradigm. But see, the paradigms are essentially spiritual in nature. They're our worldview. And so if you have a society that is no longer together on the general, like baseline, first principles paradigm, now you're fighting in the courts and in the other mechanisms of the state, pardon me, and you're not even talking about the same definitions for things. You're not even talking about the same fundamental principles. In fact, there's even a debate as to whether there are any first principles. Can we even know truth? How can a society survive that? This is essentially a need for spiritual reform, therefore societal reform, so that we can have peace and security under the structures that were set in place that have been found fantastic, frankly, in the course of human history.
Well, I agree. And like, I have a background in engineering, mechanical engineering. And so when I look at what the courts are doing, I'm like, okay, if I was supposed to design something like the way the courts are interpreting the Constitution, nothing would work. Try building a bridge with it. Everybody has a different measure of what a yard is. Somebody says it's 3 feet. Somebody says it's 2.5 feet. Somebody says it's 6 inches. And everybody's got their own yardstick going, okay, let's go and measure this, but it's got to be 3,000 yards across. Well, it's not going to work. And it's the same thing applies, right?
Yep.
And so we got to...
Absolutely. And
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
well, I was going to say, I mean, I think other countries understand this, other societies that operate from different paradigms. And, you know, it's difficult. We could get into that. I mean, some of these paradigms are very exclusive of other paradigms. Some of them are exclusive to the extent that we would consider in our paradigm criminal and immoral. But at the very least, from a philosophical standpoint, you can see that societies have to have a particular set of principles by which they're going to interpret the rest of how the rules of society operate. And I think, to your point, that this is what's happening in the United States. We don't even have the basics anymore. And we still talk about the basics. We use some of the same words, but they don't mean the same thing to people. And so I call it tribalism. I think people have different terms for it. But I see the factioning, I guess, of our society societally, you know, in general across the entire country is is seeping into the institutions as well. And what we're seeing, exacerbated by social media perhaps, but what we're seeing is that we can't even live together because we now have these fundamental views of one another that may not even be based in reality. And I think all of it stems from this idea of what do you think as a foundational principle, what it means to be human, what it means to live together, what government is supposed to do.
Well, and it also comes down to family, like you were saying before, because family is the building block of a church and it's a building block of a country. It's where you're going to learn it's a church and it's also a government. You're going to learn government from your family.
Yeah, you do.
And one of the worst things that they've done is said that men and women are the same. Men and women are equal value, but they're very different because a mother can't be a father and a father can't be a mother. And they do both very important roles that can't be replicated by the other person. But when we start blurring those lines, this is where the family breaks down. And when that begins to break down, you've got nothing left.
Well, I talk a lot because I've been thinking about this. I mean, I come by it honestly. I'm an attorney. I'm always thinking about philosophy and the basis of laws, right? But I was thinking a lot about economies. And I'm talking about not our dollars, but the idea of how do we interact with one another. And I now look at it, some people talk about light and dark. I don't do that anymore in terms of moral questions. I talk about a kingdom of consumption versus the kingdom of God. And what are those economies? And this gets to your point. What we should have is multiplication. You have a man and a woman come together, being different, as you said, of equal moral value before the Lord, human value. And they multiply everything. They multiply their work. They multiply in additional humans. They multiply in a society. Their ideas then are multiplied through their children. They build even greater things. This is how, so many things of human accomplishment have occurred. Whereas the kingdom of consumption looks at everything as not what could be, not a vision of what's out there and what can be discovered and what we can make and do. But it's a kingdom that says, what does everybody have and how do I get a piece of it?
Well,
and go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. I was just saying I agree.
And I think what we've seen, because we talk about isms, right? So Marxism is fundamentally exactly what I just described in terms of consumption. But I see it seeping into everything. There's, somebody has something I want. Instead of thinking, how can I get that? How can I multiply what I have or work with that person to build the same thing or something similar? It's how do I get that? And we're seeing that. And then those thoughts come into even the judicial space. And the judges are operating from a standpoint of, okay, who should have the thing? And how do we, determine between them? As opposed to everybody having a mindset that is far more abundant instead of, how do we manage lack? I'm tired of people managing sickness, managing lack.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. And one thing, like my daughter was pointing this out, when the Bible said that God created Adam a helpmeet, that word actually means a lifeline. There is something that when a man and a woman come together, that the sum is greater than the whole of his parts. Because I'm like,
absolutely.
God created Adam, then he created Eve. And then when he married them, that is when the image of God was complete. And he said, I'm done. My work is done here. When we go and we look at the families, when a man and a woman are together, they will do more together than they will apart.
Yes.
So when you have this adversarial nature in the families to break them apart, they're going to be less productive. Period.
Absolutely. And we're emotional beings too. And so it drains what we could be doing because we're hurt and we're, all of the things. And I'm looking at that and I'm seeing that playing out now with the breakdown of family and how that affects everything. And this is not a condemnation of any families that are broken. My heart grieves over it, but I see how much it leads to consumption. And it's now to the point, I don't know how your audience feels about these things, but, to put it lightly, it's now led to actual consumption. You know what I mean? Like through, yeah, go ahead.
Read the Epstein files. the
Right.
the whole point is what I'm saying is that when you a lot of the families that are broken, they've had a lot of help. There's a lot of money to be made by keeping the families broken. Like, and this is where, like, I have a huge issue with the court system because my oldest daughter, I lost all parental rights. I had to fight 3.5 years to get her back. I got custody of her. She went through horrific situations. They had no justification whatsoever. Then 20 years later, with my youngest daughter, because I whistle blew against COVID, and then they just went ballistic. Like, I mean, I essentially, like I tell people, I'm a slave because I was stripped of all rights by the court system, and that's not the way a court's supposed to function. And then I see this happening over and over and over again. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's supposed to be the people's mechanism to restrain the other two branches of the government.
Yes, that's exactly right. And where there's overreach by the private citizen, the court is there to adjudicate between private citizens or the citizen and the state too. But they're supposed to. You're absolutely right. I don't even have to go further into that. But here in Florida, where I am, there's a lot of freedom. We did well. I will applaud and commend our leaders where they've done well. But we still have, through Department of Children and Families, we still have the incentive of the budget every year is based on how many children are taken out of families. I am certain that when they sit down to talk about the budget, that is not how it goes. But if your budget is pegged to children taken out of homes, what do you expect is going to happen? And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing incentivization of taking a child out of the home and then let the courts sort it out. Well, they're not sorting it out.
No,
the
they're
courts
not.
are essentially going in alongside whatever the system is doing.
Yes.
It's very interesting. This is an aside, but the Supreme Court, what was it, last year, I think it was? All the years blur together. But, that we called it Chevron deference.
Yeah,
There was a
yes.
yes. Years ago that said, well, if the government agency said this, we're going to give deference to what the agency said, even though we're supposed to sit and look at these facts essentially de novo. But we're going to give deference because they're supposed to be the experts in this particular area and field and whatever. Well, that's over now at the federal level. But there's still this sentiment in the system that whoever's within the system is the expert. And of course, we saw all of that going completely nuts in COVID. But we've got to undo that sense within the system of propping itself up with these kinds of thoughts, because what's happening is it's got real world consequences of children being separated from their parents, like what you went through. I mean, it's amazing how many families are dealing with that here in Florida, and over a small disagreement regarding exactly what medical treatment, for example, their child should have. I mean, that's what's going on.
Yes, and it, like, my daughter, she's Cree. She's a part of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and in Canada, the native population, they have been dealing with this for a long time, and they get more money in taking them. So the vast majority of children in care are because of this. And so I began to look at some of these things, and I began to watch over and over again. And I grew up in Winnipeg. Winnipeg was a very bad, it was like the equivalent of Detroit. It was very bad. It was gangs and so forth. I saw human trafficking was rampant. Like, even police were involved and so forth, front page of the news and all kinds of stuff. So when I look at what is happening, I'm looking at some areas in the government that look like organized crime. And this is disturbing. I'm not saying that everyone is, but there are definitely people that they are doing this. Because we knew Al Capone bribed judges in the 20s because it was cheaper than bribing entire police forces. And I've talked to police that said, we're tired of arresting people only to allow the judges to let them free. So we need to deal with that. And the elected officials are the ones that are supposed to be dealing with the judges that get out of line, and they're not.
Well, I mean, one of the core campaign postures I have is reform the courts. I don't hear a lot of people talking about that as a candidate, but I speak on that because I'm a litigator. I've been doing this 20 years, and I've seen what's going on, and I say there needs to be accountability there. within the bounds of our laws and our system. But for example, DeSantis is in the process of asking for impeachment of a judge that continuously was letting a violent offender go, and that offender killed a child. This is the kind of thing we need to do on the one hand. On the other, I would say in civil cases, there needs to be transparency. Too much happens where there is a closed system, literally closed, like behind courtroom doors, sure, but where everybody that's in that room gives deference to the bench in a way that gives the bench no accountability.
Yes.
Transparency allows for some question. I don't want to suddenly rip apart everything that's happening. I mean, that's chaos. I'm not in support of that. But there does need to be, you should be able to stand by every decision you've made. And as a judge, decisions you make have high stakes for people. So everything that you've done, you should be able to stand by it when you have had the power to take and give high stakes things to people. That's what I'm talking about. We need to be looking at those things.
Yes, they have to be able to pass the sunlight test, and that if people look at it, they can see the justice that's done. Because I listen to, and family courts need to be changed fundamentally on how they operate.
I've got ideas on that. Yes.
Because I was talking to somebody and I said they need to start off with understanding that the child has the same liberty as everyone else. And part of that liberty, fundamental to that liberty, is to have their parents protect their liberty because they do not have the capacity to do so themselves. And that their liberty is deriving from their parents protecting it because they can't defend themselves. And so we have to start with that, and then not just allowing people to come in and take away kids and say all of these things, because now it's like you take the child and you're guilty until you're proven innocent. That's not the way the system works.
No, it's fundamentally wrong. I would even go further back. I like your point, but I would go further back. Something I'm understanding now as I look at it, speaking of paradigms that we were talking about before, there's a fundamental view within the state, and most people operating in it, that the state somehow gives out the rights to parents. Nope. That's fundamentally wrong. It's God who gives those rights. And the attendant responsibilities, which is one of the things that you were just describing, is the obligation to your child to protect their liberty and their life, and to build them up in such a way to pursue productive work as a member of society. That's your job, in part, as a parent. But when the state believes that it's giving out those rights, that's where it's deriving this idea that it can take them away. I would even argue,
that was a British imperial type of mentality when they were talking about rights, that the government, the state gave you the rights, and essentially you had privileges.
Well, right. I think that's how humans always end up over time in corruption, mental and spiritual corruption. We want to, again, it goes to this idea that there's a finite amount of things, including human value. And you get to decide as a state what that value is and who gets to take it and whatnot. That's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. And I think, in these contexts, it's if the government does not have any right permanently to take away what God has provided, then it should have some deference to that. And even in a situation, I've actually been a guardian for a child who was horrifically abused by their biological parent. So I understand that background. And I know that happens. But even in those circumstances, one thing I could posit would be, okay, the state can, if it has to, I think the community should intervene, not the state, but let's put that aside. So if the state does intervene in some capacity, it is always with the idea of rehabilitation and reunification and fostering the order and design that God intended. Not trying to completely build some separate system where the state gets to just permanently make these decisions. I also think there's a problem with the state making decisions about matrimony in the sense of being able to permanently put asunder what God has put together. I mean, I think I'm talking about paradigms here. If we think differently about this, our policy is going to be different. And in the case of children who are taken out of their homes, let's say for the sake of argument, there was evidence of abuse. What is the state then doing, or what is the community doing to change that, to draw, dare I say, repentance, to draw, what can we do to support this family so that the bond that was placed divinely can be reunified? How are we doing that? We know that children, even in bad circumstances, they weep for their parents. The child I said that I brought into my home that I was caring for because she was horribly abused, she pined after her mother. I could not, in my position, any more than the state, try to say, you should forget your mother. She's not your mother anymore. This is not how it works, and the state should not be doing that through the courts.
I know. And there's this is something fundamentally wrong. We need to just take a short break. I've got to just play something here, but we'll be right back and continue this conversation because this is very important. So we'll be right back in a moment or two.
Hello friends, my name is Keisha and I'm a proud member of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. And I'm also a survivor of human trafficking. My trafficking began in Saskatchewan, moved into Alberta, and even crossed into the United States. I was stalked, hunted, and ignored by the very systems over the last 5 years that were meant to protect me. This is why, with my father Dale Richardson, we started the Karis Project. This is an Indigenous, survivor-led movement for humanity dedicated to exposing trafficking, government corruption, and holding institutions accountable. One of the most powerful tools that we are using is the petitions for redress of grievances. These are lawful constitutional actions rooted in Canadian and US law, and in treaties that tie us together across provinces, across states, and even across borders. These petitions are precedent-setting. They create a binding record. They demand accountability while representing reconciliation in action. Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working side by side to preserve liberty for all. But we cannot do this alone. We need your help to keep this movement alive, to raise awareness and to build a legacy of justice for Indigenous women, for trafficking survivors, and for families everywhere. Thank you. Please stand with us. Your support makes this work possible. Together we can restore justice, heal families, and defend freedom. And I will close with my favorite quote. The greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who cannot be bought or sold. Men who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. And men who will stand for the right, though the heavens may fall. Thank you.
So for anybody who wants to support the fight against human trafficking, you saw the QR codes, or you can see the links in the ticker that are there, or you can go to mypillow.com/Karis or call 1-800-845-2942. Get yourself some, good stuff. And we also, if you're watching on Rumble, Facebook, or on Vocal, we have a bunch of different links and ways you can support with merchandise like this and so forth. So yeah, just had to put that plug in there. Kind of going back to that, I think that we really need to see changes in the way that we approach things, because the way we look at government is very fundamentally wrong. Government works for us. They have no rights. They have a job description. When you have a constitution, there are two parties, the government and the people. And the people are the ones who have the final say. They're called public servants for a reason, because they're slaves to the people's will, the constitution they agree to.
That's right. Well, and I think there's room for leadership as well, meaning the people say, this is the leader who embodies the qualities that we think, we want this person to be a leader of men. And, they have the character, they have the temperament, they have the competence to do this. And then where the people may be requesting of their leadership something the leader perceives not to be in the best interest, or that is going to harm or pit one group against another, then it is a space for the leader to demonstrate and persuade the people into a better course of action. But that's not what we're seeing today. We're seeing, I've got all the power. I can brute force this, whatever I want. And it's often not in the interest of the people anyways. Who knows what interest it's for. So I think we need to, like you, I think we need to return to a more foundational view of our system here in America. And I want to see leaders rising up, especially at local levels, definitely at the state level, and all the way up into Congress and in the federal executive as well, who are going to understand these principles and really reorient the way that we're doing government in this country.
Yes, and I think that sometimes it's going to take a lot of persuasion and so forth and persistence, because even if the people are well intentioned, the status quo becomes so ingrained in them they don't want to change, right? And
yeah,
so
I mean, but part of it is our comfort too, right? It's
yes.
like there's so many pieces to this, right? And I know we're having a heady philosophical conversation, on the back of a gubernatorial campaign, but I really do think it matters, because I think how our leaders think is going to tell me how they're going to engage in any particular circumstance, be it a policy question or a conflicts question, etc. But I really think that. Well, just getting back to what we were talking about before, I think that the family unit not being able to function because there's separation, there's brokenness, is then consuming a whole lot of energy that should be focused at that level for the entire society governance. Do you see what I'm saying? So, we should be vigilant. We should be paying attention to what's going on at different strata of the society. But it's very hard to do that when we need to pay bills, when the factors outside of our control are making things extraordinarily expensive. We have to worry about when we go to the doctor, if we have a disagreement with the doctor, is our child going to be on the line? All of these things are keeping us from being able to engage, I think, in civic life in the way that our founding fathers intended. And so I think, it's hard to parse out all the little pieces, but I think going back to first principles is a very good place to start. And part of the reason I'm doing this is I want to be able to talk about that on the campaign trail.
Well, yes, because the way our society is set up, you have to. It's so expensive to live. The prices are rising. People are working longer and longer. Who's watching your kids? The state. That's a big problem. Right. That is a huge problem, right?
It is, yeah, and it's all the other things. It's the inability to connect with one another and build relationship in the family unit and in the local community, right? We're often the here in the United States, that there's been a critique, and a fair one, that everybody's in these little cul-de-sacs, right, and nobody knows each other.
Yes.
Why is that? That's not even safe. You should know your neighbors. You should, and not to be nosy, but but at least know your neighbors. Is your neighbor well? Do they need help? Like, how are we going to, if we don't have that community, if you don't have that support, then you are going to end up going to the state when you need help.
Yes.
So we're setting up a whole system where the state can start to say, well, I can do whatever I want because you're dependent on me or on it. And I think we've got to unravel that, but it's going to be very difficult to do because all of our energies are drained at the small, at the most basic daily level.
Well, yes, and I think I think COVID probably made it a lot worse for the disconnection of people because of how, the lockdowns, the separation, the kids even were having developmental delays from what they were doing with the masking and everything else like that. It fundamentally changed the way life was. Because I remember when I was a kid, you pretty much knew almost everybody in your neighborhood, right? Or if you didn't know them, you knew who they were and that kind of stuff. Now it's like you said, it's not the same way. We need to get back to more of that community-based thing. And like I sat down and say, there was a time before when if somebody fell on hard times, the community come together, help him, Bob, give him a job and help him get on his feet and kind of thing.
That's right.
But when we started to get all these welfare programs where you could go to a faceless place and get a check and no accountability, then you have abuse. Because if your neighbors were helping you, you couldn't sit down and just loaf off them because they weren't going to do that. You'd have to get back to going to where you needed to be. And we need more of that, more accountability to the people around you.
Right. Well, but the abuse goes both ways. So
Yes.
in your context, I agree with you. Somebody can abuse the largesse. Somebody can abuse the mercy. But on the other hand, what if the reason that you need that mercy is because you are being abused? Is the
That
state
happens a
paying
lot.
attention to that? No, they're not. Absolutely. But the community understanding your circumstances and building a relationship with you finds out what the circumstances are. And then it's a holistic approach to deal with whatever that situation is, because every single one is going to be different. The state cannot do cookie cutter, responses to anything. Much
No.
less, I mean, we saw that in the COVID era. This cookie cutter healthcare thing was lethal, literally lethal in the hospitals.
Yes.
And I think the same thing is true in cookie cutter addressing of human circumstances. Sure, there's similarities across the board, and this is our experience in how we can relate to one another, and wisdom can be drawn from that. But fundamentally, people are unique, amazing, created beings by a divine creator, and we have to address what we're dealing with on that basis instead of trying to look at people like chattel or like commodities, which is what's happening, and that's why we're being consumed.
Yes. And I'll give you an example here. In Canada, the federal government deals with the reserves. The natives, they don't own the property that they're on. The government controls it. It's run like communism. This is how you create the circumstances for people to be in poverty, because there's no incentive. When you own something, you have more incentive to develop it, to earn income, to live off it, grow your own food and stuff. But if it doesn't belong to you, who cares? And then you can't leverage it to like borrow money to go in and do things for yourself. So what they're basically stuck. They're putting them in a position where they are forcing them into a situation where they come and take a handout. People are getting angry, but I'm like, okay, that's great that they're taking the money. We don't like it. But who put them in that position and set them up for failure? Right?
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. That's why I think always in terms of sort of the incentives behind what we're doing, the thought process behind the policies that we have, because we honestly don't need more laws. We need adherence to good laws and fewer of them.
The biggest problem.
And yeah, go ahead.
The biggest problem we're having is lack of enforcement of laws. That's it.
I think so, but I also think we have too many.
Mm-hmm.
You can't legislate morality. You can't put laws in place to make people's hearts, want to do the right thing for themselves or their neighbor. So more laws isn't the answer. And when you have way too many laws, that's when you end up with less enforcement. Honestly.
This is how one of the things that they did to help do that, when they started to separate, and you saw this happen in the Black community in the United States very easily, where they got rid of the fathers out of the home. And then when the state is there coming in, then they go to the state to do what the father did, and then they're going to end up creating more laws because they need to have what the man does. But that doesn't make sense. Support the families. Support the families.
It's never going to work.
Exactly.
Well, and then you're wondering why there's so many. I hope the term is not. It's neutral to me. Disaffected young men, and their sense of things, their intuition of what's going on is that they're being told they don't have any value, but they inherently know in their heart they do, and of course they do. And I think their instincts are correct. But what you see is then a system that is telling them, not only do you not have value, but you are immoral for getting angry that somebody's telling you have no value. And so what you're doing is you're creating this bottled up rage that's actually coming from a correct place. And it has to be channeled somewhere. And so you're creating the circumstances for violence in a tribalistic, divisive way that can easily be settled by simply being honest and saying men are necessary as part of the family. And these are the expectations morally that we have for men, and these are the moral expectations we have for women and mothers. Like, if we do that and we honor the value that people have in their families and the obligations that God has given to them, I think we'll see. I think even Jordan Peterson, a lot of what he became very famous for is essentially stating these facts more eloquently than I am right now, but basically saying, when you have responsibility, I would say you do things with your hands and you're able to produce and build something.
Yes.
Then that builds up your value, and it gives a peace in you, and it makes you more productive in the society. But you cannot be doing that when you're just telling people that they're blobs, clumps of cells, that, there's no boundary lines, there's, what you're trying to do doesn't matter. When you do that, you're destroying people from the inside out, and you expect there's going to be some backlash, and we've got to deal with that.
Well, yes, and I mean, like, going back to like what you're talking about, like when you look at the sexual revolution, which they brought on the back of a lot of drugs, they changed fundamentally the way that people thought. Like, I mean, and broke apart families, created a bunch of single parent families because through the drunk induced haze, like, oh, I'm pregnant, I don't know who the father is, like, and all these kinds of things. And then they're like, well, okay, well, we're going to pass Roe v. Wade and so forth. Here's the pill. Take away your responsibility and consequences, because normally they'd be like, what happened with the baby? Well, now you need to deal with it because that was just natural consequences. Then society begins to shift. We need to go back to having consequences for actions. If you don't like the outcome, then don't do it, right? Like, I mean, we all make mistakes, but sometimes you just have to deal with them, because otherwise, what lesson are they going to learn?
Well, and I would even, I'm not in disagreement, but I would even spin it in a positive sense. And it's this: I personally know someone. I lost her, unfortunately, to suicide, which she attempted many, many times. There was horrific abuse in her background. But I'm going to tell you, the babies that she had out of wedlock, totally unplanned, they kept her alive for several years just because she knew she had to take care of them.
Yes.
So what I want to say is this: it's not just about we should have punishment for our moral failures. That's not what you said, but I'm just saying, that position. It's also that the consequences or the outcome that comes from certain actions is designed for our well-being and our flourishing, because it can fundamentally change what we were doing. I mean, how many times have you heard the stories of people who were, you mentioned the drugs, who were completely strung out on drugs, and all of a sudden a baby's in the picture, be it the woman being pregnant or the man who was with the woman suddenly has this baby because the woman is not going to take care of the child. And it changes their life, and they become a productive member of society. They're healthy again. They raise this child. There is something powerful and wonderful about God's order to things that is meant for our well-being. Not just that the consequence is something we don't like, but it's something that's going to become more glorious and beautiful than we could have ever imagined.
And this is something that a lot of people don't want to hear, but this is true. They found that even people who their parents are criminals, they're better off more often with the parents than being taken away.
This data is crazy to contemplate, right? But that's what I was saying about the child I knew, who, I had to restrain myself. I could not speak about her mom. She couldn't handle that reality of but in my heart, if you knew what the level of abuse was, you'd understand where I was coming from. It was horrific. And yet I had to be careful, because this is her mother. There is a bond there. I have to let her find her way to a good boundary line, right?
Yes.
I can't just add more pain on top of a really awful situation. So I certainly think we have to go back to the value of people.
Yes.
And what we're doing in society, how we look at policies, the incentives we put in place, the way we want to help people always has to be based on the value
Yes.
moral value of that person, not a transactional value. What can you do for me? I mean, an inherent value that then we want to draw out. And then as we do that as a society, and I might sound like I'm pie in the sky. I really don't think so. I think we can do this. I think it's part of our, at least in the United States, I think it's part of our DNA.
Well, I'm a Christian, and I look at it. Well, what did the price God paid for us? He paid an infinite price for all of us. So that tells me the worth of each person. So I should start treating people in that manner. And like with my oldest daughter, her mother, like she was got heavily onto drugs and other sorts of things. I went down the wrong path. Like I was a stupid kid as well, but I ended up starting to get sense when I had a baby. It was like, I got to feed this mouth that ain't mine, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And then I ended up having to, deal with that. And then going through the family court thing, that just about destroyed me, where it almost put me to a point where I couldn't come back, but I had to come back from that and get through that. And I still had to let my daughter see her mother, no matter how terrible she was. I limited the exposure because if I didn't, she would end up resenting me. And I couldn't do that. And I never said anything bad about her mother. I just said things didn't work out. And she's like, her mother used to say, "Oh, your dad's saying bad things about me all the time." It's like my daughter was like, "My dad doesn't talk about you that way. You say he does, but he doesn't say that. Other people say that, but not from my dad." Because I'm like, why would I do that to my kid? Right? Like, I don't need to tell her all that stuff. She can figure out when she's older.
That's right. And I love what you said, because I too am a Christian, and I think that is an incredible sign of our value, and also the mercy. Like, I think after the COVID era, so many people were so heavily abused in the COVID era. Yourself, you were talking about what you've undergone. A lot of my clients have not been able to find another job. Either they were blacklisted, or just because of circumstances, they were not able to find another job. And not all of them were prepared for retirement at that point. There are other people who, not just that they lost a job, they lost a career, a calling. They had invested time and energy into a particular, like a firefighter, for example. This is something that you're trying to advance your career. You spend time and energy. You go up the chain, and now on, and you can't even get a job in the profession anymore. There are others who took shots in order to keep going and survive, and now they're clinging to life, and they're struggling, and they've been cut off from all medical assistance, insurance, and everything. There are people who have been heavily abused, and I didn't even mention all of it. And the thing that's happening now is there is a wound that hasn't been healed and hasn't been dealt with. There has not been restitution. And so I understand when their sentiment is, well, screw them all. They want to see justice, but in a very, like, there is so much anger there. And I understand it, but I'm also at it, I'm like, something else is going to have to happen here. We're going to have to redress those wrongs, but we also have to come to a place of understanding that there's mercy, because otherwise we're still continuing down a road of the same thing we've seen over the last few decades, of everybody at each other's throats. And there isn't going to be building, there isn't going to be justice or any of that if we continuously work down these roads. And I want to call society to a different standard, because I don't see any end to that road other than more death and destruction.
Well, the way I look at it is I look at what God does, and God goes and there's varying degrees of responsibility, and this is the way we should be looking at it, because the guy that's being coerced by the people is not going to have the same obligation as the people who are stuffing their pockets knowing that something is wrong, right? So we need to make sure that the people who knew what they were doing was wrong, and they were profiting off it and doing just wrong things, they need to get, those people don't get away. Now, if you were in a person where you're like, they were doing this to me, threatening my family, my livelihood, and so forth, there's mercy for that. You need to come out and you need to repent. God will take people he wants. Like he says, he doesn't desire the death of a sinner, but for all to come to repentance. But if you stay unrepentant, then I can't help you, right? Like, this is the main thing.
And that's the accountability piece. I'm tired of also seeing from our officials this desire to kind of, well, it happened, let's move on. No, you cannot do that from a position of leadership. So there's the accountability piece and even justice. And if we're going to use scriptural positions, you have somebody that is taken, stolen, then they have multiple fold. It's not good enough to just say, well, here's the restitution. There is a punitive component to that. And I think the government should stand in a position, the courts should be standing in a position to do that. And instead what we see is this courts are rubber stamping all the problems that happened.
Yes, because the point that I brought in was like with the engineering controls, and I blew the whistle on this early in 2020 because I'm like, they're wrong. They came from the CDC, and everybody is going down the wrong path. Like, this is 80% of your infection controls for an aerosolized pathogen like COVID was. So you could reduce 80% of that by up to 80%. Why wouldn't you do this? And the people that were notified and they shut it down, and then they used the courts to shut it down. And when I took the police to court after I reported, because I took every step, and in Canada, this would fall under criminal negligence. And so I went to the police because nobody was listening, because I'm like, somebody could die. I'm like, I don't want someone to die. My kid could die, anybody else's. And so I'm like, they need to fix this. So and they did nothing, so I took them to court. And guess what? They arrested me going into court at the direction of court and strapped me to a bed and drugged me against my will. They did this to a doctor who was blowing the whistle on the spike proteins with the babies and so forth. And I'm just like, why? And then they punished my little daughter, who I haven't seen for almost 6 years now, because of this. And I said, for what reason? Now you're like, she can't get those years back. I'm like, for me, okay, my house and stuff, that could come back, but hers development is never going to come back. And how many people has that happened to? Or they lost their loved ones or whatever else like that. They need to deal with this so that we can heal and move forward. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the idea that somehow I've had a lot of I haven't had a lot of answers, but a couple of answers I've gotten from officials when I've presented. I think we may have talked about this before, but I presented evidence on behalf of victims of what I call the hospital homicide. The COVID protocols during the COVID era was predominantly why people were dying, not because of the virus. And so it was treatment with things like remdesivir that are lethal, along with the failure to treat in other ways that should have been treated, like dealing with bacterial pneumonia, etc. And, some of the answers that have come back are, well, we don't have enough numbers to investigate this. Are you kidding? One person being killed using federal dollars should be enough to investigate. What's critical mass here? Similarly, we're in the process of dealing with some of the things here in Florida, similar to what you're dealing with in your personal situation. What is it going to take to have officials look into an agency? It took 2 years in the one case that's up in the Panhandle. I don't want to name names just in case, but 2 years of this child being away from her mother with medical conditions that she needs to have addressed. And it only took publicity. So it was the sunlight treatment, as you say, that finally got the individuals who had, in the video, it looks like they delighted to take the child away and treat the mother the way that they did. Yes. Delighted. This is a very different thing than just simply believing I have to do something and I'm not really liking it, but I'm going to do something with calm. No, this was something else. It took 2 years to get all of those agents in that organization fired.
Yes, and I interviewed her, and they put a gag order on after that, which I'm glad that I was able to interview her, so that
let me tell you about the gag order. Can I tell you just because we might be out of time? But I want to tell you about this. One of the things that I want to say, vignette about what's going on in the courts. That order, I've read it, and it says, among other things, it's like any party or non-party is prohibited from publishing blah, 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 blah information about the agency, about agents and so forth in the court. Mm-hmm. Did you hear what I said? Any party or non-party. Dale, where is the jurisdiction of the court over non-parties?
I know.
That's a direct First Amendment violation. The court can't just say everybody in the world is on a gag order because of this. That is insane. Any first-year law student would have been able to read that draft and say, "Oh, this won't fly. This is an automatic appeal." Are you kidding me?
You should see some of the orders that they were pushing out here in Canada, and some of the other orders that I've seen. This is the common thing that's happening all over the place, and they're overstepping their boundaries. And people need to have the brakes put on them so that it can function properly. Otherwise, it'll never function. Right? This is and
we've got to have the courage to do it. We've got to say, but here's one of the issues, and I for your listeners, I always like to leave with this, and that is the scale of the problem feels so heavy that we feel we can't do anything, that there's a hopeless situation. And that's where I say it's not. But if it takes limiting the scale of what you see that's going on so that you can identify measurable steps to take to address some of these things, then that's what you should do. And I want to remind everybody, we spent a lot of time today talking about how people can benefit their local communities and their own families. I would strongly urge anyone to really see that the actions you take within your own family and within your own local community are very critically important to addressing the larger systemic problems that we see. So there shouldn't be despair. If scrolling or looking at the news is causing despair, put it aside and build relationship, work with people within your family. Try to come together with the people in your family where there's a strained relationship. Even that is of value at the broader level. And then in your community, that is always something we can do. And I think it has a lot more merit than people realize.
Yes, it does. And I think that, yes, it's going to take work. It's going to take people coming together, and we need to get to the common core set of values. And yeah. I think that we need to start thinking about who we're putting into government. And I've been a big proponent of this because we're responsible for the actions of the people that are there. And like I say, I'm more critical of the person I vote for than somebody I didn't vote for. Because if they did something that they did wrong, it's like, well, why? I didn't send you to do this. And so now there needs to be accountability so the next guy doesn't do that. And most people, and support the people that want to do good instead of, you know what I mean? And so I think we need to fundamentally need to do this. And like I say, the government's like a toddler. They need to have direction from the people. And if they don't have the oversight from the people, what's going to happen? Let a toddler run your house and see what happens in a few days, right?
Absolutely. And if I may, I'm going to plug then to that point. And I know some of your listeners may not be in the United States and may not even be in Florida, but I would be honored by their support. And that's at Rachel for Gov, FORGOV. That's RACHEL FORGOV.com. All of my social media handles are the same, at Rachel for Gov. And I do want to say too, another reason I'm here doing this at this time is that the platform of Florida as a state is very wide. People in the United States are watching Florida to see what Florida does. And people are watching outside of the United States to see what the United States does and watching Florida because of that. So it's a really critical time. And I want to call on anybody else in the race in these midterms to really consider the gravity of the situation and to think about that, because these are really critical times.
Oh, yes, they are. There's a lot going on in Florida. If you can hang out after we're done here for a minute, sure. I would like to talk. But I'm going to close here with a prayer and so forth, because we need a lot of prayer in this country, in the world right now, because everything seems to be going on fire, but we need to bring it, put it out. All right. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your love, your grace, your mercy. Lord, we thank you for the work that Rachel has been doing to help the people around her and protect the children and the families, and help more of the men and the women to come together to rebuild our families, our churches, our community, our nation, and that we can protect the children who need it the most at this critical time is my prayer. In Jesus' name, Amen. All right. Thank you guys all.
Thank you so much, Phil.
You're welcome. And thank you guys all for coming, and we'll see